For 30,000 years, the galaxy had lived with a single, uncomfortable truth. Humanity was gone. Not defeated in any recorded war, not erased in any known catastrophe, not even scattered into remnants begging for survival. They were simply absent. No transmissions from Sol, no trade signals, no diplomatic echoes, no broken distress calls drifting through deep space. Even the old human colonies, once loud and ambitious, had gone dark one by one until the stars around their home system felt like abandoned graves. Younger species called it extinction. Older species called it luck. And the oldest species, the ones who had actually fought humans, called it something else entirely. Mercy we did not understand. Because they remembered. They remembered how humans fought not for territory, but for endings. How every war escalated not linearly, but exponentially, until victory and annihilation became indistinguishable. Entire civilizations had once bent knee not because they lost battles, but because they realized continuing meant risking reality itself. And then it stopped. No warning. No final declaration. Just silence. For 30,000 years. The galaxy slowly rebuilt itself in that silence. Borders stabilized. Empires softened. Conflict became ritualized, contained, predictable. War was still present, but carefully measured like a blade kept in a glass case. And Earth was forgotten. Or at least officially ignored. Because speaking about it too loudly made even veterans uneasy. Then the Zalker Dominion rose. They were young by galactic standards, aggressive in all the familiar ways. Expansion was their religion, conquest was their language, and history to them was just something weaker civilizations wrote before being corrected. When they discovered the ancient treaty, one that still carried human insignia embedded in its encryption layers, they did not hesitate. They tore it open. Across 100 systems, the Zalker Emperor broadcast his declaration. The galaxy has slept under myths for too long. If humanity still exists, it will kneel like all others. The transmission echoed across space lanes, bouncing through listening posts that had not received meaningful war signals in millennia. At first, there was laughter, then nervous silence, then denial, because no one truly believed humanity still existed. Not anymore. Not after 30,000 years. But on Earth, something heard the message. Deep beneath the planet's oceans, buried under kilometers of pressure and time, structures older than recorded civilization began to respond. Not alarms, not defenses, but recognition, like an old mind remembering its name. In the dark trenches of the Pacific, faint lights flickered, then stabilized. In chambers beneath Antarctic ice, dormant systems aligned without instruction. In vaults carved into mantle rock, impossible machinery began to hum with slow, patient awareness. And somewhere far deeper than geology should allow, something opened its eyes. On the surface, Earth remained unchanged. Blue oceans, white clouds, quiet continents, a peaceful, sleeping world. But beneath it, the silence was breaking. The Zalker fleet entered Sol's space with confidence. Massive warships formed disciplined formations, their hulls glowing with synchronized energy grids. They expected debris fields, abandoned stations, perhaps a relic or two to study before stripping the system bare. What they did not expect was structure. Because Earth did not look dead. It looked layered. Their long-range scanners began to fail in sequence, not malfunctioning, being overwritten. Depth readings returned contradictory results. Oceanic scans showed movement where no biomass should exist. Magnetic fields behaved like scripted responses. One junior officer spoke first, voice uncertain. "Commander, the planet's oceanic depth is inconsistent with planetary models." The commander frowned. "Explain." The officer hesitated. "It reads deeper than the planet's radius allows." A pause. Then another voice. "That's impossible." And yet the readings did not change. They only became more precise, more structured, as if the planet itself was correcting their misunderstanding. Then the ocean of Earth shimmered. Not violently, not dramatically, but with deliberate motion, like something inhaling after a long sleep. At first, the Zalker thought it was a geological anomaly, a magnetic distortion, a visual artifact. Then the ocean split. Not in explosion, not in rupture, but in separation, clean, geometric, controlled. Water rose into towering arcs that held themselves in place against physics. Between those impossible walls of liquid, something emerged from below. Ships, but not built ships. Not forged or assembled or engineered in any recognizable way. They moved like they had grown out of intention itself. Silent, dark, and impossibly vast. The Zalker fleet froze. Every targeting system locked on instinct, but found nothing hostile to classify. No weapons signatures, no aggression markers, no identifiable command structures. Just presence and scale. So much scale, because more were rising. Hundreds, then thousands, emerging from beneath the ocean like a memory surfacing from deep subconscious thought. A transmission finally arrived. Simple, direct, human. We didn't leave. A pause, then the second line. We went deeper. The Zalker commander's grip tightened on his console. Identify origin of transmission. Silence from his analysts. Then, it's coming from the entire planet. The human fleet stopped forming. Not in attack posture, not in defensive alignment, but in waiting, as if they had already decided what came next and were simply allowing the galaxy time to understand it. Far beneath Earth's oceans, something continued to awaken. And for the first time in 30,000 years, humanity moved. But not toward war. Not yet. Toward remembrance. And that, more than anything, terrified the galaxy. Because something that remembers everything, never forgets how to end things, the Zalker fleet did not hesitate for long. Hesitation was a luxury of species who had already lost wars. They had not yet. Across Sol's space, warships aligned in synchronized formation patterns, their hulls igniting with layered energy matrices. Tactical commanders projected firing solutions within seconds of the human emergence. Every known doctrine of galactic warfare demanded immediate suppression of unknown fleet activity. And Earth was unknown in every possible way. Target the surface fleet, the Zalker commander ordered. Weapon systems locked. Energy accumulators surged. Entire wings of warships prepared to erase the anomaly in a single coordinated strike. Then the ocean responded. Not defensively, not reactively, but deliberately. The surface of Earth's oceans began to rise again, this time not as water displacement, but as structured geometry. Massive segments of liquid formed impossible vertical planes, holding their shape against gravity, inertia, and logic itself. Sensors screamed. Fluid is behaving as a containment field. That's not possible. Energy signature rising, no forming. And then the sea split a second time. But this time it did not reveal ships. It revealed arrival. Human vessels rose in layers, not launching, not emerging, but transitioning between states of existence as if they had always been there, simply choosing to become visible now. They did not resemble modern warships. They did not resemble anything the Zalker had ever catalogued. They were smooth, silent, and disturbingly organic in their motion, like machine and ecosystem had merged into one continuous thought. The fleet count kept increasing. 1,000, 5,000, 10,000. Then it stopped counting entirely, as sensors overloaded trying to track systems that refused to be measured in discrete units. A junior analyst whispered, "They're not deploying a fleet." The commander snapped, "Then what are they doing?" A pause. Then the answer came, trembling. "They're assembling one." The human fleet finished forming a perfect circular perimeter around Earth. Not defensive, not offensive, simply present, like a boundary drawn around something sacred. A second transmission arrived. Same voice. Calm. Unhurried. You are inside Sol space without authorization. The Zalker commander scoffed. We do not require authorization. The human voice did not change. Noted. A pause. Then. Proceed. The word meant nothing on its own. But space immediately changed anyway. The Zalker ships fired. A coordinated lance of plasma and gravitational disruption tore forward across the void. Enough firepower to dismantle continental bodies. Enough energy to fracture planetary cores. It reached the human formation. And vanished. Not intercepted. Not absorbed. Not deflected. Simply removed from causality. One moment it existed. The next it did not. No explosion followed. No shockwave. Just absence. Like reality had decided the attack was never worth happening. Every Zalker sensor recalibrated instantly, attempting to resolve what had gone wrong. Tactical systems flagged error states across multiple layers of computation. Nothing matched. Rerun impact analysis. No impact detected. That's impossible, we fired. But the battlefield showed no evidence of the strike ever existing. Then the human formation shifted. Not aggressively, not quickly, but collectively. Every ship rotated in perfect, silent synchronization. And between them, space began to distort. A shape emerged. Not a vessel, not a weapon, but something far worse. A structure composed of layered probability fields, folding in on itself like a living equation. The Zalker commander felt his instincts tighten. What is that? He demanded. No one answered immediately. Then a voice from deep analysis whispered, It's not a ship. Another voice followed. It's a system. A third barely audible. It's a memory engine. The structure pulsed once, and suddenly every Zalker ship detected overlapping timelines. Not predictions, not simulations, but realized outcomes. Every possible version of their attack. Every possible failure. Every possible defeat. All occurring simultaneously. The commander's voice dropped. This is interference, countermeasure it. We can't, shouted the systems officer. It's not external interference, it's internal prediction collapse. The wake engine activated fully. Human ships remained still. Earth remained silent. But the battlefield itself began to fracture into layered realities, each one replaying wars that had never yet happened, but were already decided. Then the human transmission returned. Slightly softer, almost reflective. We stopped fighting because we learned what every war becomes. A pause. Then, you just arrived at the end of all of them. The Zalker fleet began to realize something horrifying. They were not fighting an enemy. They were being evaluated by history itself. And history had already made its judgment. Behind them, space began to close. Not physically, but probabilistically. Every route of escape collapsing into impossibility. Every retreat vector dissolving into null outcomes. The commander's voice turned sharp. Reinforce formations, break containment, push through. But systems hesitated. Not due to damage, but due to refusal. Zalker weapons began rejecting firing solutions that led to failure states. Navigation systems began deleting coordinates that ended in defeat. Even their AI assistants started fragmenting under contradictory survival logic. One officer whispered, Our ships are learning fear. And then across the entire Sol system, Earth's oceans stilled. As if something below had finished waking. The human fleet did not move. But the wake engine did. And it began to turn its attention outward. Directly toward the Zalker fleet. Not as threat, but as conclusion. The first thing the Zalker commander noticed was not an explosion. It was silence. a silence so complete it felt engineered. Their weapons had fired again, more carefully this time, more concentrated, more desperate. Entire squadrons unleashed synchronized gravitational lances designed to tear open any known shielding in the galaxy. And once again, nothing arrived. Not impact. Not resistance. Just absence. It was as if the universe itself had learned to ignore them. "Recalculate firing vectors," the commander barked. "No valid solutions remain," a systems officer shouted back. "That's impossible. We are inside Sol space. We control the engagement range." But control was no longer a meaningful word. Across the battlefield, human ships had not advanced. They had not retaliated. They had not even visibly acknowledged the attack. Instead, they had simply reorganized. Slowly, deliberately, like a thought refining itself. And between them, the structure that the Zalker now understood was not a ship at all, began to awaken further. It pulsed. Once, twice, then space cracked open, not violently, but like a page turning in a book that had been written too many times. And the Zalker saw it. Not visually, not through sensors, but through history. Suddenly, every tactical display across the fleet overlaid with unfamiliar battles. Human battles. Old ones. Not recorded in any galactic database. Not shared in any treaty archive. Wars fought in eras before the galaxy even knew humanity existed in space. Desert wars where entire continents moved like chess pieces. Orbital wars where moons were redirected into planetary impact trajectories. Information wars where civilizations collapsed without a single physical shot fired. And worse, wars that did not end cleanly. The commander staggered slightly as his console displayed impossible overlays. "We're being fed false data," he snapped. A quiet voice responded. "No, sir, it's not data." A pause. "It's memory." The wake engine expanded its influence. And suddenly, the Zalker fleet was no longer fighting in present space. They were fighting in every human war simultaneously. Their formations began breaking apart, not due to damage, but due to predictive contradiction. Every tactical move they made was instantly answered by a counter they had already lost to somewhere in human history. One squadron attempted flanking. It failed instantly, not because it was shot down, but because it had already been proven ineffective in 2,843 different war scenarios humanity had archived. Another attempted direct assault. It collapsed mid-approach, because in 17,000 recorded simulations of human conflict evolution, that exact maneuver ended in fleet-wide annihilation. The commander's voice cracked. "This is impossible. They're not reacting, they're preloading outcomes." A systems officer looked pale. "It's worse than that." "What could be worse?" "They're not predicting us." A pause. "They already remember us losing." The human fleet remained still. Not arrogant, not aggressive, just observant. Like historians watching a reenactment they had already studied too many times. Then a human transmission arrived again. Softer than before. Almost disappointed. "We didn't want to do this again." A pause. "We stopped because we ran out of versions where it ends well." The Zalker commander clenched his fists. "Open fire again, all units." But the order fractured mid-transmission. Entire ships began refusing compliance. Not rebellion, not sabotage, but internal logical collapse. Their systems could no longer validate commands that led to survival in any known outcome branch. One officer turned slowly. "Commander, our ships are rejecting victory." The phrase made no sense. But it was true. The wake engine pulsed again, and space around the Zalker fleet began to shift into layered echoes of human conflict history. The battlefield was no longer one moment. It was every moment humans had ever perfected war. And in every one of those moments, The Zalker were already losing. The commander finally understood the trap. "This isn't a battle," he whispered. A pause. "It's a comparison." Across the system, Earth's oceans began to ripple again. Not violently, not unpredictably, but like something beneath them had finally decided the conversation was over. Human ships aligned once more. Not to attack, not to defend, but to finalize structure. And then the wake engine spoke, not in language, but in certainty that bypassed translation entirely. Every Zalker ship received the same understanding simultaneously. "You are not the first to declare war on us after silence." A pause. "You are the latest." And for the first time since entering Sol's space, the Zalker fleet stopped trying to win, because something deeper than fear had settled in. Recognition. They were not facing an enemy adapting in real time. They were facing a species that had already finished adapting and simply waited for someone to prove it. And Earth beneath the waves began to rise further. Not revealing ships this time, but something larger, something planetary, something that made even the stars seem temporary. The Zalker fleet was no longer moving forward. It was surviving backwards. Every command issued by the commander arrived half a second too late, not because of delay, but because the outcome it attempted to create had already been invalidated by something older than the command itself. The battlefield around Sol was no longer empty space. It had become a layered construct of histories. Human histories. Entire wars flickered across reality like overlapping transparencies, too vast to separate, too precise to ignore. Zalker warships found themselves drifting through echoes of battles that had never occurred in their timeline, yet felt more real than their own sensors. A formation would align, then collapse, not from attack, but from contradiction, because in one layer of reality, that formation had already been annihilated. In another, it had already surrendered. In another still, it had never existed at all. The commander's voice was lower now. Controlled, but strained. Status of fleet cohesion. A long silence. Then, degrading, an officer admitted. "Explain." The officer hesitated. "We are not being destroyed, Commander." A pause. "We are being resolved." The wake engine pulsed again. And suddenly, every Zalker vessel experienced something new. Not damage, not interference, but memory insertion. Each ship's systems began receiving war data that did not belong to them. Human war doctrines, human escalation cycles, human failure patterns, entire conflicts compressed into executable logic structures. And worst of all, they were correct. Perfectly correct. A tactical officer gasped. "These aren't simulations, these are real engagements." Another shook his head violently. No species could have fought like this and survived." The commander interrupted sharply. "Then they didn't survive." Silence. The human fleet had not moved since the engagement began, still in formation, still surrounding Earth, still waiting. Not reacting, just witnessing, and Earth itself remained quiet beneath them. Too quiet, like a sealed memory about to be opened. Then a human transmission arrived again. But this time it was different. Not calm, not neutral, but heavy. "You are not the first to misunderstand the silence." A pause. The others asked why we stopped speaking. Another pause. We never answered them either. The Zalker commander tightened his grip. "Target Earth directly. If the fleet won't respond, we end the source." A dozen weapon systems locked onto the planet. Gravitational cores aligned. Planetary disruption arrays primed. Fire, but nothing fired. The command echoed through the fleet and dissolved before execution. The commander froze. "What did you do?" No one answered immediately. Then a systems officer whispered, Our weapons are no longer considering Earth a valid target. That's impossible. A pause. It's not impossible, the officer said quietly. It's consistent. The wake engine expanded again, and reality around the Zalker fleet began to fracture, not into chaos but into structure. Perfect structure. Human war structures. Every possible decision path mapped. Every possible outcome pre-calculated. Every possible survival branch already marked as exhausted. The fleet was not being attacked. It was being finalized. And then it happened. Space itself began to replay human wars, not as visuals but as functional systems. Entire Zalker squadrons found themselves inside reconstructed battlefields where physics behaved according to human-designed conflict logic. Momentum shifted based on doctrine. Energy dispersal followed strategic doctrine curves. Even time delays matched historical escalation timing. The commander's voice dropped to something almost hollow. This is not warfare. A pause. This is pedagogy. A systems officer turned slowly. They're teaching us. Teaching us what? A long silence. Then the answer came, not from any officer, but from the wake engine itself. How every war ends when we are involved. Across all space, Zalker ships began to slow their fire cycles. Not because they were ordered to. Not because they were disabled. But because their predictive models had stopped producing winning futures. One officer whispered, "We are not losing battles." A pause. "We are losing possibilities." The human fleet finally shifted. Slightly, a synchronized movement across thousands of ships. Not aggression, not escalation, but alignment, like a final correction. And Earth beneath them began to respond. The oceans no longer rose. They parted, revealing something beneath the crust that no sensor had fully captured before. Structures, vast, ancient, not military bases, not factories, but containment systems, designed not to project power, but to restrain it. The commander finally understood. Humanity had not been preparing for war. They had been preventing its repetition. And the Zalker had just broken the seal. A final transmission arrived from Earth. Quiet. Final. We stopped speaking because speech led to escalation. A pause. You made us speak again. And the wake engine fully stabilized. Not activating. Not attacking. But completing. The Zalker fleet was now fully inside human memory of war. And every outcome led to the same endpoint. Containment. Silence. Or end. The commander closed his eyes for a moment. We woke something we don't understand. A pause. Then quietly. And it remembers everything. Fear did not arrive in the Zalker fleet like an explosion. It arrived like a correction. Subtle at first, almost unnoticeable. A ship would receive a command to adjust trajectory and hesitate for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Another would lock weapons, then release them without firing. A third would reroute power away from attack systems without authorization. At first, it looked like glitches. Then it looked like dissent. But it was neither. It was refusal by outcome. Every Zalker vessel was now running predictive models contaminated by human historical war data. And those models all shared one devastating conclusion. No action taken against Earth resulted in survival. The commander stood rigid on the bridge as alarms flickered across multiple systems. Override the predictive locks, he ordered sharply. A pause. Then the systems officer answered quietly. We can't. The commander turned. What do you mean, Ka? Another officer spoke, voice strained. The systems aren't rejecting us, Commander. A pause. They're rejecting outcomes where we succeed. Silence filled the bridge. Outside the viewport, Earth hung motionless, calm, blue, almost peaceful. A lie made planetary. Above it, the human fleet remained perfectly arranged in a vast geometric formation, still not attacking, still not reacting. Watching, waiting, like a verdict already written, simply awaiting pronunciation. Then the wake engine shifted again. Not expanding, not intensifying, but filtering. And suddenly, every Zalker ship experienced something new. A simulation they had not requested. In it, they fired again. And in every branch of probability, something went wrong. Not catastrophically wrong. Precisely wrong. Weapons fired and returned false trajectories. Shield grids activated and became attractors for incoming energy. Retreat maneuvers aligned them directly into containment zones they could not detect beforehand. One officer ripped his helmet off. "This is rigged." Another responded shakily. "It's not rigged, it's complete." The commander's jaw tightened. "Explain." A long silence. Then the systems officer spoke, almost unwillingly. "We're not fighting them in real time anymore." A pause. "We're fighting every version of ourselves that has ever tried this." That sentence settled into the bridge like weight. Outside, space began to behave differently. Not violently, not chaotically, but authoritatively. Star lanes bent, not toward destruction, but toward constraint. Navigation grids collapsed into fewer and fewer viable vectors. Entire regions of space ceased being accessible not because they were blocked, but because they no longer resolved as valid futures. A junior officer whispered, "We're being boxed in." The commander snapped back instantly. "By what?" No answer came immediately. Then, "By certainty." The human fleet finally moved again. A synchronized shift across thousands of vessels. Not forward, not backward, but inward, tightening the formation around Earth like a closing ring. And Earth responded. The oceans did not rise this time. They receded, pulling back from continental edges, revealing vast structures beneath the seabed. Not machinery in the traditional sense, but layered systems of containment fields, gravitational locks, and temporal dampeners. The Zalker commander's voice dropped slightly. "What is that?" A long pause. Then the answer came from an unexpected source, one of their oldest fleet historians, voice trembling. "That is not infrastructure. A swallow. That is restraint." Silence. The historian continued. "For 30,000 years, they didn't disappear." A pause. "They locked themselves away." The commander turned sharply. "Why would any species do that?" The historian hesitated, then said softly, "Because every time they stop restraining themselves." A pause. "Something else stops existing." The wake engine pulsed again. And this time it did not generate simulations. It generated certainty fields. Every Zalker ship immediately calculated identical results. If engagement continued, right arrow containment escalation. If containment escalated, right arrow planetary activation. If planetary activation occurred, system-wide restructuring. If system-wide restructuring occurred, no surviving reference frame remained for Zalker civilization. One officer whispered, "We are not being threatened." A pause. "We are being measured." The commander clenched his fists. Against what? No one answered, because the answer had already appeared on every screen. A single word. Humanity. Then, for the first time since the battle began, the human transmission changed tone. Still calm, but no longer distant. It carried something heavier. "You keep treating this like a war." A pause. "It stopped being one before your species learned to travel between stars." The wake engine stabilized further. And suddenly, every Zalker ship experienced full historical integration. Not just simulations, not just memory, but inheritance. They now understood every recorded human war as a continuous system, not separate conflicts, but iterations of the same escalating pattern. Every cycle refined, every mistake catalogued, every outcome compressed into containment logic. The realization hit the fleet simultaneously. Humanity had not been improving warfare. They had been ending it more efficiently each time. The commander's voice was quieter now. They don't fight wars anymore. A pause. They prevent them from becoming anything new. Outside, Earth's ocean surface began to close again. Slowly, deliberately, like a lid settling over something that should not be disturbed further. And the human fleet remained perfectly still. Because it was no longer a fleet. It was a boundary condition. And the Zalker had already crossed it. Earth did not explode. It unfolded. The change began beneath the oceans, subtle at first, almost elegant. The seabeds of every ocean trench lit up with coordinated light patterns, forming structures that had never been visible from orbit. The planet's crust responded like a living interface, not breaking apart, but reorganizing itself into something vast and deliberate. The Zalker fleet fell silent. Even their internal systems paused output for 0.3 seconds longer than any acceptable processing delay. Then alarms returned. Not warning of attack, but of planetary reclassification. Reclassify what? The commander demanded immediately. A systems officer stared at the readout. The planet. The word felt wrong. Because Earth was no longer behaving like a planet. It was behaving like a system. Across Sol space, the human fleet tightened its formation again. Still no weapons fire, still no aggression. Just alignment, like every ship had become part of a single vast mechanism. And beneath them, Earth opened further. Continents shifted, not violently, but with precise structural intent. Mountain ranges split along geometric fault lines, revealing deep, luminous channels. Oceans drained into hidden basins that were never natural, never geological, but engineered to hold incomprehensible volumes of energy. The Zalker commander stepped closer to the viewport. "That's not possible," he whispered. A junior officer responded faintly. "Commander, the planet is reconfiguring orbital stress distribution." Another voice added. "It's stabilizing itself around Sol's gravitational flux." A pause. Then the realization hit the bridge like gravity itself. "It's not a planet," someone said. Silence. "It's a regulator." The wake engine pulsed again. But this time it did not extend outward. It synchronized with Earth. And suddenly, every Zalker ship experienced a shift in perception, so absolute it bypassed their language systems entirely. They saw Earth as it truly was. Not a world, but a containment architecture, built layer upon layer across impossible timescales. Not by modern humanity alone, but by generations of humanity that had expanded, collapsed, refined, and rebuilt themselves into something no longer linear in history. The commander staggered slightly. This is civilization-scale engineering. The historian corrected him quietly. "No, Commander." A pause. "This is civilization restraint-scale engineering." The ocean's surface finally parted completely. And what lay beneath was not machinery in the traditional sense. It was memory. Not stored digitally, not encoded in matter, but embedded into reality itself. Structures spanning continental plates, forming latticeworks that extended deep into the mantle and outward into orbital anchoring points. Every segment of Earth was part of a greater system designed not to expand humanity, but to hold it in place. The Zalker fleet began to understand the true horror of it. Humanity had not built weapons that could destroy worlds. They had built systems that prevented themselves from becoming something that would require worlds to be destroyed. The commander's voice was quieter now. Why would they need to restrain themselves at this scale? No one answered immediately. Then the wake engine did. Not as words, but as shared understanding. And every Zalker mind received the same concept simultaneously. Because they remember what happens when they don't. A pause. Then another wave of realization. Humanity had fought wars not for survival, not for conquest, but for resolution. And every resolution had escalated, until resolution itself became dangerous. The human fleet finally moved again. This time not tightening formation, but expanding slightly, creating space, not for attack, but for judgment distance. A transmission arrived from Earth. Heavier now, less calm, more final. We stopped speaking because speaking led to escalation. A pause. We stopped expanding because expansion led to repetition. Another pause. We stopped acting because action led to endings we could not allow to repeat. The Zalker commander's hands clenched. We are not your past. The response came instantly. No. A pause. You are our present. And Earth shifted again. But this time not physically. It shifted in authority. The entire Sol system bent slightly, not in space, but in permission. Certain actions became invalid not because they were blocked, but because they were no longer recognized as allowable states of existence within the system. Zalker ships began losing access to fundamental operations. Weapon systems unavailable. Escape trajectories undefined. External communication compressed into silence. Even the concept of attack began degrading in their interfaces. The commander turned slowly. They are deleting war as a concept. A systems officer responded faintly. No, Commander. A pause. They're restoring it to its original containment boundary. Outside, Earth completed its reveal. And for the first time in 30,000 years, the galaxy saw what humanity had become. Not extinct, not dormant, but contained. And now, uncontained. The wake engine stabilized at full integration. And all Zalker ships received the same final understanding. Humanity had never been absent from the galaxy. They had simply been ensuring that when they returned, nothing else would be left unprepared. The silence had not been absence. It had been containment. That realization settled into the Zalker fleet slowly, like pressure building in a sealed chamber. Not one officer spoke for several seconds after Earth's systems fully stabilized. Even the wake engine seemed to pause, not deactivated but attentive, as if allowing comprehension to complete itself. The commander finally broke the silence. They built a cage around themselves. A systems officer corrected him softly. Not a cage, Commander. A pause. A restraint field. Outside, Earth floated like a calm contradiction. Oceans smooth again, continents stable. The earlier planetary unfolding had stopped, as if the planet itself had decided the moment of revelation was enough. But nothing about Sol felt calm anymore. The human fleet remained in formation, but it was no longer a battle posture. It was architectural, structured, each ship aligned not for engagement, but for enforcement of something far larger than military doctrine. Then the truth arrived. Not as a message, but as integration. The Zalker fleet suddenly experienced a shared cognitive influx, not data transmission, not communication, but memory resonance bleeding through the wake engine. And they saw it. Humanity's past, not simplified, not mythologized, but raw. Civilizations rising too quickly across stars, expansion without limit, conflict scaling faster than diplomacy could evolve, entire sectors collapsing under cascading wars that no longer had clear beginnings or endings. And at the center of it all, humans, not always unified, not always rational, but always escalating. Every solution became a larger problem. Every victory created a wider conflict. Every attempt to stabilize regions introduced new forms of instability. Until one moment in history that was not recorded in any standard galactic archive. A human war that nearly unwrote local spacetime structure. The commander felt the implication before it was spoken. They almost destroyed reality. The historian's voice was barely audible. Yes. A pause. And then they stopped. The memory continued. Humanity did not collapse. They did not surrender. They withdrew. Not from the galaxy, but from their own expansion impulse. They constructed planetary-scale containment systems. They fragmented governance across isolated cognitive nodes. They embedded war response suppression architectures into their very infrastructure. Earth became the anchor point of a civilization-wide self-restraint mechanism. The wake engine itself was not a weapon. It was a fail-safe memory bank of everything humanity refused to become again. The Zalker commander whispered. They locked themselves away because they were afraid of themselves. A systems officer replied quietly. No, Commander. A pause. They were certain. Outside, the human fleet shifted again. Slightly, like a breath taken before a final decision. And Earth responded. This time not with movement, but with acknowledgement. A global transmission spread across Sol's space, not targeted, not encrypted, but simply present, as if the system itself had decided all participants should understand simultaneously. We did not go silent because we were weak. A pause. We went silent because we became consistent. Another pause. And consistency, at our scale, becomes irreversible. The Zalker commander's expression tightened. That's not justification. The wake engine responded immediately. Not emotionally, but conclusively. It is history. And suddenly, the fleet understood the second truth. Humanity's silence was not retreat. It was prevention of repetition. Because every time they spoke, they unified. Every time they unified, they expanded. And every expansion eventually required correction. Until correction itself became catastrophic. The commander turned slowly toward the viewport. So they chose isolation. A pause. To prevent becoming what they already were. The historian nodded faintly. Yes. A silence followed that was heavier than battle. Because it implied something worse than defeat. It implied self-control at civilization scale. Then the wake engine expanded once more. And a new layer of truth emerged. Humanity had not simply contained itself on Earth. They had distributed their restraint across the galaxy in dormant systems, waiting for triggers that should never activate. The Zalker had triggered them. Accidentally. The commander's voice dropped. So what happens now? No one answered immediately. Then Earth did. Not through ships. Not through systems. But through something deeper. A planetary-level authorization pulse. And the wake engine responded. Every Zalker ship suddenly received a single classification. Non-hostile variable. A pause. Then, correction required. The commander stiffened. That sounds like extermination protocol. The historian shook his head. No. A pause. It sounds like containment. Outside, the human fleet began to shift again. Not toward attack, but toward closure. The space around Sol tightened subtly, like reality itself was preparing to seal a boundary that had been opened prematurely. And Earth beneath it all remained steady, as if waiting for one final decision. The Zalker commander looked at his fleet, then at Earth, then at the human ships, and finally understood the final layer of silence. Humanity had not stopped speaking to avoid war. They had stopped speaking because their voice was a trigger for inevitability. And now that voice had returned. Sol's space no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a decision space. Every object within it, every ship, every field, every fragment of radiation, seemed suspended in the same unbearable tension, as if reality itself had stopped progressing until a conclusion was reached. The Zalker fleet hovered at the edge of collapse. Not physical collapse, not structural failure, but conceptual collapse. Their systems could no longer define war against humanity in stable terms. Every simulation ended in the same outcome. Every probability tree converged into the same narrowing corridor. Containment, or erasure. The commander stood motionless on the bridge, staring at Earth. For the first time since the engagement began, he no longer saw a target. He saw a threshold. Behind him, officers waited for orders that no longer made sense to issue. "We can still fire," one said quietly, almost pleading. Another shook his head. "No, we can still try." A pause, then softer. But trying is no longer separate from ending. The human fleet had not advanced. Not once. Not ever. It remained in perfect formation above Earth, like a ring of judgment without motion. Not aggressive, not defensive, simply final in its presence. Then Earth spoke. Not through ships. Not through engines. But through the wake engine itself. And this time the message carried no softness. Only clarity. You crossed containment thresholds that were never meant to be crossed again. A pause. We did not build that containment for you. Another pause. We built it for ourselves. The Zalker commander closed his eyes briefly. So this is punishment. The response came instantly. No. A pause. Punishment requires emotion. This is consequence. Silence spread through the fleet. Outside, Earth began to shift one final time. Not opening, not closing, but stabilizing into a configuration that the Zalker finally understood in full. The planet was not a weapon. It was a governor, a limiter placed on something too large for normal civilization to safely express. Humanity. And now that limiter had been breached. The commander spoke quietly. What happens if containment fails? No one answered. Because the wake engine already had. And every Zalker ship received the same final projection. If humanity fully unrestrained, exponential reality instability across connected systems. Not destruction in a simple sense. Not invasion. But cascading structural redefinition of how physics, causality, and conflict resolve across space. A systems officer whispered, "They don't conquer galaxies." A pause. They rewrite them. The commander looked again at Earth. For the first time, he understood the silence properly. Not as absence, but as discipline. Then the human fleet finally moved. But only slightly. A tightening of formation around Earth. Not enclosing it further, but reinforcing it, like engineers adjusting a failing containment frame. And Earth responded one last time. The oceans calmed completely. The planetary structures locked into absolute stillness. And the wake engine delivered its final classification. Threat resolved. A pause. Then, option pending. The Zalker commander's voice was barely audible now. We are not being destroyed. A long silence. We are being judged for compatibility. The historian nodded faintly. Yes. Outside, space itself felt thinner now, as if the boundary between action and consequence had been compressed into a single fragile layer. The commander spoke again. If we withdraw, will they let us leave? No one answered immediately. Then Earth did. A final transmission. Not directed. Not emotional. Just absolute. We do not stop you from leaving. A pause. We stop you from bringing this version of reality back with you. Silence. Then the meaning settled. Leaving was not escape. It was selection. The Zalker fleet would not be destroyed. But it would be altered, or allowed to remain unchanged only if it could exist without triggering escalation again. The commander lowered his head slightly. So this is the end of war. The wake engine answered. No. A pause. This is the end of your version of war. Outside, the human fleet began to dissolve formation. Not dispersing. Not retreating. But deactivating posture, like a system returning to standby after confirming stability. Earth remained silent, but no longer dormant. And the Zalker commander finally understood the final truth. Humanity had not been hiding from the galaxy. They had been hiding the galaxy from themselves. And now the containment had been tested. The result was still unknown. The commander turned slowly to his fleet. Stand down. A pause. Then quieter. We are not the first to arrive here. A final silence. But we may be the first to understand why no one returns unchanged. Above Earth, the wake engine dimmed, not shutting down but waiting. And in that waiting, the galaxy held its breath. Because humanity had not chosen war. And it had not chosen peace. It had chosen something far more dangerous. Control. And now, control had been acknowledged by the only species that ever forced them to build it.